As we move into chapter 11, we start to see some reform movements within Hinduism. And one of those big reform movements is what is today modern day Buddhism. Now, interestingly, modern day Buddhism has a number of adherents and doesn't have a number of adherents. It's not as large as we might think, but its influence is powerful. And an influence that we see in a lot of different ways, even within the West today, as we seek enlightenment. And Buddhism was a religion that sought enlightenment for the people that were around. Buddhism traces its origins back to an original teacher called the Buddha. Now, when we go to restaurants and Chinese restaurants specifically, we'll often see what we call the fat Buddha, the jolly Buddha, and you recognize him, he's sitting there and he's heavy. This is actually a Buddha that is to come. He is one that they are waiting on. But the original Buddha was not the fat Buddha. It's a different Buddha. His name, according to tradition, was Siddhartha Gautama. Lived somewhere in the 5th or 6th century BC, before Christ, and was reportedly a prince in northern India. Now, the stories about him, we don't know much about the stories, but there was definitely a man who lived at that time who started a philosophy known as Buddhism today. In fact, when I was in India, was able to go to the place where he received enlightenment, and we went to his tomb, and just a beautiful setting where he sat under the tree and awaited for enlightenment. But anyway, so Siddhartha was born somewhere between 563 and 483, prince in northern India. His birth is surrounded by a number of legends. The most popular is that his mother, before she was pregnant, because there's great debate as to whether or not she was a virgin, much like the virgin birth, or what the story is exactly. But anyway, she saw a white elephant. Now, white elephants are somewhat rare in India and around the world, really. And so she saw this white elephant, and so she sought out information. Why did she see this white elephant? And so the people told her that the wise men and the prophetic figures gave her an interpretation that her son was either going to be a famous warrior, one who would have a vast kingdom, or he was going to be a great religious leader. Now, his father, again, it's interesting to try and reconcile everything. You got to understand. But anyway, he lived within his kingdom. His father knew these stories, and so he wanted him to be a great warrior. He wanted him to be a great leader. So he kept him confined within the palace grounds and did not want him to go outside of the palace. And he was married at the age of 16, had a child, Rahula, and lived in great luxury, bordered on decadence there within the palace, and lived this very rich and wealthy lifestyle. At the age of 30, he began to have more and more questions about the outside world. Now, this is where varying stories will differ. But supposedly, at the age of 30, he decided he wanted to go out and he wanted to see the world, or see what was out there in the world. Now, his father didn't want him to experience the realities of life. He didn't want him to experience sickness. He didn't want him to experience death. So he didn't want him to see religious renunciation or monkhood. So he went out first, his father went out, and he got rid of all of those things, according to one legend. And when Siddhartha went out, he wasn't supposed to see any of those things. He was just supposed to see the beauty of life, the children playing, and families, and things like that. No one was to be sick. No one was to be in poverty. No one was to be suffering at all. So he went out. And but here's where the devas, the gods, got involved. And so as he was out, they came to him in the varying forms. And so they came in the form of an old man on the verge of death, a sick young man on the verge of death. He saw a funeral processional, things that his father had thought he had taken away from him, but that were there. And then he saw a guru, a religious man who had renunciated the world. And so as he saw those encounters, this evidently disrupted his life dramatically. And he wanted to understand. And so at about the age of 30, he denounces his marriage. He leaves his wife and his child. The story is that he escapes the castle and goes out and begins to practice a life of religious meditation to seek spiritual truth. This is known as the Great Renunciation. And for 6 years he wanders, visits numerous sages and holy men, practices various forms of arduous spiritual exercises and meditations. It said that he would live for days on one grain of rice, and he would starve himself as he sought to have an understanding of the universe and have an understanding of the world. Disillusioned at the end of 6 years, it says that he sat under a fig tree there, and he decided, he ate one last bowl of rice, and he was going to meditate. And he was either going to die or he was going to reach enlightenment. During that meditation, he experiences temptations related to political power, sexual seduction, demonic attack, intellectual prowess. At one point, one of the gods sends a flood, and if you look at varying statues of the Buddha, there's one statue in which a snake is over the top of his head, protecting him from the weather, and he is coiled up underneath him, raising him up out of the water in order to allow him to meditate. And during that meditation, he finally reaches enlightenment. And when he reaches enlightenment, it's said that he bathes, he dresses, he eats, and he goes back to his followers. He had, by that point, obtained some followers. At first, they're nervous because they see that him dressed, they see him clean, they see him well-fed, and they think, what has happened? But he begins to explain to them the way of enlightenment. So he comes to a philosophy that the only solution to the anguish of life comes from embracing what he calls the middle way. And this is a way of renunciation. He sees humans as a lotus plant. Now, a lotus plant is a plant that can either float on the water, it can be beneath the surface of the water, or it can fluctuate between the two. And he argues that people are like that. Some are capable of seeing the truth, some are incapable of seeing the truth, and some are in between and they need help in order to understand what the truth really is. And we do that through renunciation of all things. Buddha lived for about 40 years after his enlightenment. His death was in 483, they say, from eating a piece of spoiled pork. And he passes away at that point. There's a huge monument built for his tomb where he is buried there in northern India. And he establishes this understanding that any can, if they practice the right things, they can reach enlightenment. From 483 on, his disciples have a great council. They form an authoritative canon. The two groups eventually form, the Hinayanists and the Mahayanists. The Hinayanists argue that only monks, only those who are most dedicated, can reach enlightenment. It means literally the small boat. The Mahayanas means the large boat. And it argues that any pious person, anyone, you don't have to be a monk, can reach this state of enlightenment by their own efforts. And so within Buddhism, there is a rejection of the caste system and an understanding that anyone can reach enlightenment if they do the right things and if they have the right understanding, which then takes us to chapter 12.